Greetings and salutations, and welcome back to more depictive descriptions of cross-dimensional domination on Grudge Match Unlimited, the show where the characters and creatures of fiction are pitted against each other to answer the burning, age-old question of who would win if they fought. Today's contest is a fantasy matchup for the ages that is a bit of a break from the norm, as it doesn't pit two characters against each other, but two races. That's right, break out your armor, axes, and arrows. It's time to answer that most epic of questions: who rules the realms of fantasy fandom, elves or dwarves? Since multiple different versions and depictions of these races exist, this Grudge Match Unlimited will be a 3-round affair. Round 1 will compare their mythological and folktale origin versions. Round 2 will delve into their most popular literary versions from the works of J.R.R. Tolkien. And Round 3, their most popular modern-day version, that of the wildly popular online game World of Warcraft. So let's waste no time and delve right into our first round, looking at the mythological and folktale origin versions of these two races. Well, both of these races, elves and dwarves, originate in medieval Germanic and Old Norse mythology. For elves, the earliest and most common depiction of these creatures was that of small, magical, almost fairy-like creatures that were thought of as being the cause of illnesses, and they would often be thought of as firing arrows to cause illnesses in humans. And that eventually evolved, continuing with their small, diminutive size, into the elves of myth such as Santa's elves and shoemakers and cobblers, the idea of small, bearded, jovial characters who were tradesmen, magical creatures who completed tasks with most of their time. So a very large detraction from the more modern version of elves thought of as being warriors in the worlds of fantasy. In the original days, elves were small magical creatures who, at their most malevolent, were causing illnesses in humans and were archers who fired arrows of a magical, non-lethal nature. Early mythological dwarves had many similarities to the kind of dwarves we see nowadays. Short in stature, generally thought of as bearded, but being very strong, superhumanly strong and powerful, and having their affinity for metalwork. They were excellent smiths and crafters, oftentimes being able to craft the most potent of magical items, weapons, and armor. Now, because there was occasionally a lot of similarities between the two in some of the depictions of elves being very similar in being short, bearded men who were tradesmen working in Santa's workshop or as cobblers, and very similar nature to the dwarves of the time, short, bearded, but working more in mines and as woodcutters, there was occasionally not a lot of distinction made between the two, and elves and dwarves were terms that were sometimes used interchangeably. But elves were more generally thought of as having more affinity for magic and more fairy-like creatures, occasionally being referenced as beautiful women who were found dancing in fields to entice the passions of men, and were occasionally more aligned with characters like dryads and nymphs. So a lot of interchange between the magical, mythological characters of that day. But when it comes right down to it, the most violent and malevolent version of elves at the time were that of archers who fired non-lethal arrows that would occasionally make human beings sick, and dwarves were warriors who created the most powerful armor and weapons of the day. So, at their most vicious, dwarves of the mythological realms and ages were much more powerful than the elves. So in round 1, is going to go to the dwarves of medieval Germanic folklore. So let's move right along to round 2, and we're moving into the literary realms, and obviously the most popular and famous of the literary fantasy versions are the works of J.R.R. Tolkien and his Middle-earth series. So we saw two very distinct races in Tolkien's works, divulging wildly from the mythological versions. Elves were no longer short in stature, were no longer tradesmen who toiled away in Santa's workshop. Now, elves had become almost the polar opposite of what they had been. Now they were tall, statuesque, beautiful in nature, fair of skin, but also superhumanly powerful. Elves possess superhuman strength, superhuman speed and agility, immortality, as well as a strong affinity for crafting very potent weapons, elvish armor and weaponry, and swords and bows and arrows are absolutely second to none. But if those weapons and armor were going to be secondary to anyone, it would have been the dwarves. The dwarves of Middle-earth in Tolkien's works were very similar to the dwarves of mythological folklore in that they were short in stature, but extremely strong and powerful, maybe even superhumanly strong, and still characterized by being excellent smiths, great weaponers, and creators of armor, so they were known as having a very powerful army as well. Now, the elves and dwarves of Middle-earth never particularly cared for one another. There was always a strong animosity between the two races, with the dwarves viewing the elves as snooty and egotistical, and the elves viewing the dwarves as uncouth and slovenly. So there were occasions when the two would come to blows to one another, and most famously this happened in the Battle of the Five Armies. Now, in battle, Tolkien's dwarves were very vicious. Because of their extreme strength and their vigorous energy in combat, they were very deadly at close range. But the elves absolutely dominated the long-range fighting with their unerring accuracy with their archery, and of course being no slouches in terms of their close-quarters combat because of their superhuman strength, speed, and agility. The two most famous elf and dwarf combo in Tolkien's work were obviously that of Gimli the dwarf and Legolas the elf, who were close friends but would always keep a running tally of how many kills each of them had when in combat, always trying to outdo the other. And frankly, Legolas far outpaced Gimli every time. So while the dwarves are certainly no slouch in the battle department with their battle axes and vigorous fighting nature, frankly the elves of Middle-earth were nothing short of the greatest warriors and most powerful standing army Middle-earth had ever known. So in the literary round 2 and the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, the elves are going to take this round. So that brings us to our third and final round, moving to the most popular modern-day incarnation of these two races, and that would have to be in the wildly popular online MMORPG video game, that of World of Warcraft. Now, many similarities exist between the elves and dwarves of World of Warcraft with the elves and dwarves of Tolkien's literary works. The elves continue to be tall in stature and muscular in size, also fair of skin, and the dwarves remain slight in stature but very strong and powerful, regularly bearded and uncouth looking, but still strong warriors as well. But there are some differences from Tolkien's literary works. For one thing, the World of Warcraft races have all been scaled to be fairly even so that one race doesn't have a wide degree of superiority over any of the others, so they're kind of normalized out. So the elves have less superhuman traits than they did in Tolkien's work, and a greater focus and affinity for nature, often being seen as living in the forest, living in trees, not so much in the castles of Middle-earth that they did in Tolkien's work. And also, the elves of World of Warcraft have a greater affinity for magic as well. Now, the dwarves in World of Warcraft are still industrious, but they also have some magical affinity where that didn't exist in Tolkien's literary works. As previously stated, the races have been scaled to be fairly even, but there are some differences between them. Both have a couple of occupations and specialities that the other lacks. Elves can be druids and demon hunters, whereas dwarves cannot be those two particular occupations, and dwarves have the skills of being paladins, shamans, and warlocks that elves cannot be. So both have a few things that they can do that the other cannot. But both can be equally skilled in terms of being warriors, in terms of being rangers, in terms of being hunters, in terms of being mages. So this round is much closer than either of the previous ones. But where it's going to turn is that between these two races, one is, just as a overall race, more powerful than the other. The elves of World of Warcraft are among the oldest and most powerful of the races of the Alliance. Frankly, their magic is the most potent and powerful of all in the Alliance and is second to none. Also, their skills as warriors and their skills as hunters has made up the part of the backbone of the Alliance war machine ever since its origination. The smithing and technology that the Dwarves bring to the table for the Alliance is certainly an absolute boon to the entire organization as a whole, but comes right down to it, the Elves have been around longer and have wielded a wider assortment of powers in the realms of Azeroth. So a close third round is going to go to the Elves of World of Warcraft, making the final tally 2-1 in favor of Elves, with the Elves of the literary works of J.R.R. Tolkien and the Elves of World of Warcraft winning the day over the more prominent Dwarves of the mythological, medieval, Germanic, and Old Norse mythology. So Elves are going to take this Grudge Match Unlimited. Message me down below, let me know what you think of the outcome of this fight, and as always, suggestions for future Grudge matches. Thanks for watching, we'll see you next time on the next edition of Grudge Match Unlimited.